Less than 48 hours after Robert Mueller broke his silence on the Russia report, Attorney General Bill Barr says he thinks the former special counsel did not use the, quote, right law to assess the facts. Listen to this.
We analyzed the law and the facts, and a group of us spent a lot of time doing that and determined that both as a matter of law, many of the instances would not amount to obstruction.
As a matter of law.
As a matter of law. In other words, we didn't agree with the legal analysis. A lot of the legal analysis in the report, it did not reflect the views of the department. It was the views of a particular lawyer or lawyers. So we applied what we thought was the right law.
Joining the conversation, former U.S. Attorney Greg Brower. He also served as the FBI's Assistant Director for the Office of Congressional Affairs. You guessed it, his boss was Jim Comey. And Darrell West joins us, Vice President and Director of Governance Studies and the Brookings Institution. He's also the author of Divided Politics, Divided Nation, Hyper-Conflict in the Trump Era. Perfect example of that right here. Greg, what do you make of what Barr said? For us mere civilians, the right law versus the wrong law.
Well, good morning, Stephanie. I think these comments have confused things even more, if that's possible. You have to remember the whole point of the special counsel, of any special counsel, is to take the investigative decisions in a politically charged investigation away from the political appointees at the Department of Justice. And so the idea that despite the independent special counsel's findings and conclusions as to what the law says, that the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, both Trump appointees, would weigh in and disagree and make decisions around the special counsel completely undermines the whole point of appointing the special counsel. And so, as I said, I think things are even more confused now.
So, Greg, why wouldn't Bill Barr have simply told Robert Mueller, you left out your last chapter, time for a conclusion?
Well, that's a great point. Yeah, great point. I've said all along that if I was the AG or his chief of staff and the special counsel came to me and said, you know, we really just can't decide this obstruction of justice issue, I think my advice would have been, you need to go back and decide it, because as the AG, I'm the president's appointee. And by the way, I'm the guy who wrote that 18-page memo about obstruction. So I'm not going to get involved in making this decision. Your job is to make the decision. Tell me what you think should happen. If it's a indict, well, then we'll talk about whether the OLC opinion allows for that. If it's not indict, fine, I'll accept that, but you make the decision.
Darrell, is Bill Barr helping the president's case here in confusing the American people? He put out a summary 2 days after the report came out, basically saying nothing to see here. Here we are 2 months later. There's a lot to see.
Barr is not helping his boss, Donald Trump.
He's not.
It would have been nice if Barr had told Mueller this broader interpretation of the law, because everybody who knows Mueller says he's a very rules-based guy who really follows the law. His understanding of the law was that under the DOJ opinion, he could not indict a sitting president. So he was very limited in how he could present information in the report. He outlined 10 instances of obstruction of justice, but was not able to reach the conclusion that this guy could be or should be indicted because of his view of that DOJ law.
Then why do you say he's not helping the president? There's a lot of bad stuff in that report, and the president has successfully pushed a narrative saying, I'm exonerated, nothing to see here. And quite a lot of people believe it. So this confusion seems that it's a positive for the president.
Well, at Mueller's press conference this week, he made it clear he did not exonerate President Trump.
Do you actually think he made it clear?
I think it is clear. And certainly if you look at Volume 2, all the details that they provide on witness tampering, the way Sessions' recusal was handled, Michael Cohen, Paul Manafort, and so on, like there's a lot of evidence there. But Mueller did not feel like he could recommend an indictment, but he basically left it to what he called other venues, which is clearly a referral to Congress to consider impeachment as a possibility.
Greg, Bill Barr also talked about his decision to investigate the investigators. Here's what he said.
The like many other people who are familiar with intelligence activities, I had a lot of questions about what was going on, and I assumed I'd get answers when I went in, and I have not gotten answers that are at all satisfactory, and in fact have probably more questions, and that some of the facts that I've learned don't hang together with the official explanations of what happened.
What do you mean by that?
That's all I really will say. Things are just not jiving.
Things aren't jiving. Is that enough to justify an investigation? Greg, he's talking about your old boss, Jim Comey. They could do an investigation here and not find anything.
Well, Stephanie, he's actually talking about Jim Comey, Rod Rosenstein, Dana Bente, the general counsel at the FBI, potentially even Chris Wray. Everybody who has been involved in this or has reviewed it has concluded that the FBI and DOJ engaged in no misconduct. And so to initiate an investigation, essentially echoing presidential tweets based upon no real evidence, and the Attorney General has said himself on the record that he's not aware of any misconduct, but he wants to get to the bottom of it. Well, there's an OIG investigation pending. It seems to me that the better course, the usual course, would be for the AG to simply allow the IG to finish his work and then take appropriate action as necessary. But this politically charged investigation, again, based upon what apparently the president would like, is unprecedented in my experience.
Yeah, but what if the president wants this, just like he wanted a voter fraud commission? And if there's no wrongdoing, like the voter fraud commission, the president will have to take it off the table.
Well, that's what's so troublesome about the way this seems to be proceeding. It's just not the way FBI and DOJ operations are generally reviewed. Again, there's a process for that. It's the Office of Inspector General. And so this, unfortunately for the AG and for the department, to do it this way looks political. And that's a very bad thing for the department.
Very bad thing for the department. And Daryl says, from a political standpoint, it's time for Congress to act.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.